Hello and welcome to everyone. We are so excited you could all be here today for the webinar. My name is Mary Mall, and I will be going over our agenda as well as helping with this online platform. We will begin with our host Tarek introducing our guest speaker. After the presentation, there will be time for questions and answers, which will be moderated by our host. After the Q&A portion has concluded, I will share a few announcements related to the Zare Institute and the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding. And then the webinar will be closed out with remarks provided by Tarek. We hope you are all able to stay until the end, but if you can't, there will be a recording of this webinar posted on the Zare Institute's website and YouTube channel by early next week if you'd like to watch it again or share it with others. For today's webinar, comments and questions may be submitted through the comment section on the platform you are using to view the webinar. Most likely that's Facebook. Our host will be facilitating the Q&A portion after the presentation. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the webinar. Now I'm going to pass to Tarek to introduce our presenter.
Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today with you. I'd like to first start off with a recognition that we are about a week away from Indigenous Peoples Day. That's usually the second Monday of the month. And this Indigenous Peoples Day is something that grew out of a particular conference from my research that occurred in 1977 on the discrimination against Indigenous peoples in the Americas, held by the United Nations in Geneva. That was 45 years ago, and it was in the early 90s that a variety of cities in the United States, such as Berkeley and Santa Cruz, decided to institute Indigenous Peoples Day as a holiday instead of what was traditionally celebrated as Columbus Day. Then, last year, Joe Biden formally commemorated the holiday with a presidential proclamation, becoming the first president to do so. Indigenous Peoples Day is one way to acknowledge the important role, the history of Indigenous peoples. And land acknowledgments has been another such way of doing so. You may have heard, either on this webinar or in other spaces, acknowledgement given to the land upon which the event is taking place and the indigenous roots of that land. Today, we'll be talking about land acknowledgements, but more than that, we'll be talking about how to go beyond land acknowledgements and what's behind the need to go beyond land acknowledgements. And to help us do so, we have a special guest. I'm going to attempt. Waŋbli Wapјáha Hokšíla is Dr. Edward Valandra's Lakota name, and we'll ask Dr. Valandra to say a little bit more about that. But a few things to note. We've got the full bio that you can see on the Zare Institute webinar for today's event listing. Just want to pull out that Dr. Valandra got his PhD in American Studies in New York, and has since been teaching at a variety of colleges, universities, and also setting up the study of, let's say, a community for the advancement of Native studies, which is indigenous-based, to further this work. Dr. Valandra has written extensively, served on local tribal councils, and plays a very special role in the Living Justice Press community, which is the Living Justice Press brings us many of the important restorative justice works that we all know and love. Dr. Valandra also was the editor of Colorizing Restorative Justice, part of the Living Justice Press publications, and in so doing, helped bring or center the voices of BIPOC folks in the restorative justice movement. So with no further ado, I'd like to start off, but before I do that, I do want to encourage you to ask any questions or make any comments anytime throughout this webinar. We will have dedicated time towards the end, but your questions and comments as moderator, I might try to weave into this conversation that we'll be having between me and Dr. Valandra. So with that said, Dr. Valandra, I'd love to turn it over to you. Perhaps you can start with saying a little bit more, helping us understand what's important to know about your name, and then we'll go into the topic for today.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Tarek for inviting me, and then I want to thank the IT crew. As things go, a little earlier, we were just trying to work out some glitches, and I'm glad we did. I guess with respect to my Lakota name, Tarek and I were having a little discussion about that, and my white name is, I go by Edward Valandra, or in more formal circles, Dr. Valandra. And so I gave Tarek a real quick immersion into the Lakota language. And so, but my name, is Waŋbli Wapјáha Hokšíla. And one of the things that I think what I would just comment about that on is not so much its origins and what it means, because that's a very standard way how Indigenous people engage settler audiences. What I wanted to do was to have my name there, because normally I want my Lakota name to be mentioned, and that's for political reasons. It's not for any kind of cultural resonance or anything like that. I insist on my Lakota name only because I love to watch settlers and listen to settlers struggle with pronouncing an Indigenous name or Indigenous words, which in a larger sense is a reacclamation of Indigenous or indigeneity in North America. And then to have settlers struggle with Indigenous names is one small act of resistance to the genocide, the ongoing genocide that we are experiencing. So it's a very political and intentional part of a lot of Indigenous peoples to have settlers say their native names and enjoy the struggle that settlers have with it. And again, that is to remind settlers that Indigenous peoples are still here. Permanently, I would like to argue and add to that, which is not the settler narrative. So I think that is maybe how I will address Tarek's question about my name.
Thank you, Dr. Valandra. So to go to the topic of today, I've heard, I think it was the first time, it was maybe 7 years ago when I first heard an Indigenous land acknowledgement made at an event. I think it was in Toronto. And I found it very meaningful for me. There was something about putting front and center this part of the history, which was so often invisible. And it was not at all an event related to Indigenous peoples. Since then, I've heard a wide variety of different land acknowledgements. Many of them will just acknowledge the presence, either past or ongoing, of a variety of Indigenous folks. And if you're not familiar, there's a website that is a resource for this called Native Land. Maybe we'll get the website link into the chat, native-land.ca. So many will just acknowledge the presence of particular peoples on that land. Some of them go farther than that, and they go to naming the history, often brutal history, that Indigenous peoples have faced. And once in a while, a few of them will go farther than that and talk about the present. I'd like to ask you, Dr. Valandra, to go into what does a land acknowledgement mean to you? And where would you like to see land acknowledgements go towards? Where should they be moving towards?
Well, this gives me the opportunity to actually read my land acknowledgement that I personally have written as an Indigenous person, as a Lakota. And I wrote my land acknowledgement in response to the many land acknowledgements that are proliferating out in settler society. And I agree with Tarek, where a lot of the land acknowledgements are benign. They don't. I think they become more performative in nature, and it's just something that is kind of part of the ritual, as common as almost singing a Star-Spangled Banner at every event. So it's a box that they check in these public spaces. So anyway, I did my own land acknowledgement, and I attach it to all my emails. I think that's just one way to get the word out. So just let me read my land acknowledgement, and think about the land acknowledgements that you have heard, and just maybe do a mental comparison, or similarities or differences as a result. So on my emails, as I sign off, I have this Indigenous land acknowledgement. And this is what I say: greetings from my homelands. The Ochechi Shakawe Oyate Makoche. Our homeland is where our relatives come from, where our relatives live, where our relatives love and defend each other. To coexist with our relatives is a difficult responsibility, but one made more so ever since settlers invaded our homeland. Settlers, among other things, have nearly exterminated our relative, the Tatanka Oyate. Compared to 150 years ago, few of them survive today. Settlers have enclosed our relative, the Mini Oyate. There are several structures built on the Minnesota that, like bondage, constrain their natural life-giving flow. Settlers have drilled into our relative, Uchimaka. The drilling has left our grandmother Earth with notable scars: Mount Rushmore, Crazy Horse Monument, Homestake Mine, Dakota Access Pipeline, and the abandoned radiation testing sites. Settlers have illegally colonized and therefore unlawfully reside in our homeland. We have never consented to these and other settler-led harms. Hence, the litmus test of any land acknowledgement is the rightful return of stolen native land. So that's my land acknowledgement that I attach to all my emails. And my native people who get my emails and read that, I get a response like, right on. I love that. Settlers, very muted. They don't even try to acknowledge, like, wow, I've read that. So it's interesting, even the response I get from when emails go to native peoples, they read it, it's an affirmative. Settlers, it's nothing. So I don't know if they even get down to the end of reading the email or not, or maybe think it's just another Indigenous land acknowledgement that is performative. But it has this land acknowledgement was written in response to the many land acknowledgements that I've been hearing and reading, and I thought, no, this is a for real Indigenous land acknowledgement from a Lakota, and this only speaks to my people and my experience, not all Indigenous peoples and all Indigenous experiences, but specifically to mine. And maybe that's part of the problem with Indigenous land acknowledgements, is they're so generic and so pan-native that it's encompassing, but there are uniqueness to these land acknowledgements, particularly if they're written by Indigenous peoples themselves. Now, I know when they do Indigenous land acknowledgements, they'll pull in one or more Indigenous peoples to help people write an Indigenous land acknowledgement, an institution or an agency or a nonprofit. And so I think that may be a step in the right direction, but for my own personal understanding, I thought, hell, I'll just do my own, let the chips fall where they will, and move beyond, as we're going to talk about. So again, so I think that's kind of the thing that I would talk to the Settler Society about these Indigenous land acknowledgements and what they really mean. Again, they could be very benign, or they could be very proactive, which I think mine is. And maybe the defining quality of my Indigenous land acknowledgement is one, it names who's been harmed, who's done the harm, what is the harm, and what it takes to undo the harm. Those are the four elements you can find in my my land acknowledgement, whereas many of the settler inspired land acknowledgements don't do all of those, or may do one of those. But mine, I think most Indigenous land acknowledgements, I would argue, should be able to name who's been harmed, in my case, my people, who's done the harm, in my case, settlers. What are the harms? I've named three of them: the extermination of the buffalo, the damming of the Missouri River, and the drilling in our home sites. The drilling in our homelands, Mount Rushmore, Dakota Access Pipeline. And then what is to be done? How to undo that harm? Well, return the stolen land. So those are the four elements that I thought encapsulated what an Indigenous land acknowledgement should have.
Thank you, Dr. Landro. I wonder if you could say a little bit about how not including those four components in a land acknowledgement may actually be doing more harm than good.
Well, okay, thank you for that question, because one of the things that I find about land acknowledgements in general is I think they're moving more and more toward trying to say, whose land this belongs to, the Indigenous peoples, this land belongs to. Now, again, I say belongs as in present tense. One of the things that happens in land acknowledgements is always the use of past tense. So I could have said land acknowledgements could acknowledge who this land belonged to, as if it's no longer Indigenous peoples, when it still is. It's stolen land. So I think sometimes you have to look at those land acknowledgements and see how they might position people in the past tense. So that's one thing I think land acknowledgements, settler ones, really have to acknowledge, that use of the past tense might pervade that land acknowledgement. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is who did the harms, and I say settlers. Another thing might be is that they default to like the U.S. government, or let's say the federal or the Canadian government. These are federal governments. I think that's smoke and mirrors, because I want to name the settlers. Oftentimes they get into these kind of dialogues. They say the government, had this removal policy. The government had this boarding school policy. Well, excuse my language, but I call bullshit on that. It's settlers. It's the settlers that did that. And so, for settlers to be disingenuous and say, well, the government did that. Well, I know enough about U.S. civics to know that you guys have an election coming up January 8th. You're going to go to the polls and you're going to cast the vote. And you folks have a representative government. So if there's a policy to remove natives, well, it's because that's what you want, and your representatives are carrying out that policy. So I don't want to distance settlers from the harms that their government did. It's much like the death penalty argument where the Not in My Name movement, where I may not have pulled a switch to electrocute someone. Personally, I didn't pull that switch, but because it's done in the people's name, I am just as accountable for that death as if I was there actually pulling the switch. So I'm trying to get settlers to understand that the removal of Indigenous peoples, you're responsible for that. And of course, I think Tarek may get into that a little bit more in terms of, oh yeah, you can share that. Sorry, Tarek, I'm kind of not paying attention to the chat. So, but anyway, what I'm trying to say is, I think I'm trying to get settlers to acknowledge that they are the responsible parties to the harms that we are experiencing today.
Yeah. So I really appreciate the notion of leaving things in the past in a land acknowledgement that doesn't create a sense of the urgency and the immediacy of the present, continued and ongoing dispossession of land. And I think, of the land acknowledgements that I've heard that talk about the custodial relationship that Native peoples would have over land, but doesn't really acknowledge the harm that those peoples have experienced, and even the benefits that settlers enjoyed as a result of the relationship that Indigenous peoples have had with the land. So it's a sort of an invisibilizing phenomenon. There's a comment in the chat that looks at this. You use the words belong to. And there are some of us, myself included, who have heard that there's a different relationship to the land that Indigenous peoples have than your typical property-orientated, individual-orientated Western society might. Can you say a little bit more about what does it mean to belong to land, or land to belong to Native peoples?
Well, I knew I was going to get asked that question. One of the things that we can look at the Western, like the Western paradigm, or maybe even its epistemology. For the West, land belonging to someone means private property, basically, or state-owned property. So it's put in such a way that ownership of land is in a wheelhouse of settlers. You own land, it's private property, our state land, public lands. That's how I understand settlers belong to the land. They own it. I think for Lakota people, belonging is also one in which it involves our origin stories. For example, the Bering Strait theory that the West hangs its hat on, so then that they can call us immigrants as well as the Europeans that came over. The Bering Strait theory is something that settlers hold on to and use against Indigenous peoples. But if you look at every Indigenous origin story, it says nothing about crossing the Bering Strait. our origin stories are specific to an area that we are from. So that, in a sense, is the belonging that we talk about, that we are of that land, that we are of that land and the land is of us. That's a very large metaphysical gap to jump. I understand that. So belonging then, there are so many things that happen in your homelands that show the relationship between, let's say, Lakota people and the natural world. You know, a lot of things do happen, and ceremonies are given to us through the natural world. Knowledge is given to us through the natural world. So then we have these relationships with the natural world, which includes the earth, but it is so the belonging then is one in which you physically, emotionally, and spiritually identify with the area. And I know that I was out to California at a reservation in Northern California this past week. You know, and I seen the tall redwoods and the ocean, and it felt, though beautiful, I felt out of place. But when I'm in the Northern Plains, oh, it feels like a second skin to me. It feels like a second skin. Whereas if I'm visiting other people's homelands, it's beautiful and striking, but I know it's not, I don't belong to it in the way that I belong to the Northern Plains. And the Native people there, of course, when I hear them talk about that part of Northern California, it's very much how we talk about the Northern Plains. So I don't know if, you know, belonging is, I can't probably put a one-to-one relationship to that, like white skin or settler skin with, I own this piece of property, so it's mine. I have the documents to prove it. Whereas ours may be more in the realm of the metaphysical and probably in the physical as well, because we have sacred sites, significant sites where things have happened, and then we recognize that as such. That's a good question.
Thank you for that. Let's turn. So we talked about when land acknowledgements talk about the past and name Indigenous peoples as a thing of the past. You write about and talk about the permanence of settler colonialism, why this isn't just something of the history books. Can you say more about what does that mean to have to really acknowledge the permanence of settler colonialism?
And permanence, I mean by structure. So if we go back to Patrick Wolf, who I think in the 90s wrote about settler colonialism and framed it in such a way, gave it some meat, if you will. He talked about settler colonialism as being very unique to other kinds of colonialism in the world. For example, when the British colonized India, as an example, after 200 and maybe 50 years, the British eventually left. The French left Algeria. You know, the Belgians left the Congo. So we have that kind of colonialism, which I think people recognize, and they had the decolonization efforts after World War II. Settler colonialism is very unique in that settlers come to stay. They come to stay. So rather than existing with indigenous peoples, settler colonialism says that settlers come to stay and they will displace indigenous peoples in lieu of making their own national identity. So when the settlers came over to this part of the world, they came to stay. And for them to, I mean, they had a couple of paths to go, but the path that settlers chose and still choose to this day as we speak is that they're going to displace indigenous societies and replace it with one of their own. So that's why you have things called Americans. That's why you have a thing called Canadian. That's why you have a thing called Australian. That's why you have a thing called New Zealanders. I can guarantee you 500 years ago, those were not even in the ether, but they are now. And so American, to be an American then is an acknowledgement that you, and not even implicit, that you have replaced indigenous societies for one of your own, the one that manufactured. So I think that's one thing about settler colonialism that I would mention. So then that led to Patrick Wolf talking about the logic of elimination. That is a part of that. Is settler colonialism, settlers come to stay, and with that embedded and baked into that is the logic of elimination. So that's why, it can be, the logic of elimination can be very direct as genocides of indigenous peoples, or the ethnic cleansing features of the Indian Removal Act of the 1830s, when, hundreds of indigenous people were ethnically cleansed east of the Mississippi west. That's all part of logic of elimination. What is it today? Well, today we're dealing with many states are trying to say in their educational curriculum, they want 1776 curriculums, our non-critical race theory curriculum, in which then they're trying to reassert the settler narrative, which is good, positive, progressive, forward-looking, and not talk about slavery, restrictive immigration, Japanese internment, and the displacement of indigenous peoples. So I think what the thing that helped launch this whole project was Patrick Wolf's settler colonialism, which he said it is a structure and not an event. Mm. So then it's past, present, and future. And so the very behaviors that settlers engage today are affirmations of settler futurity. That is, settlers will be here 100 years from now, 200 years from now. And what we try to do as indigenous people is to break open, or even as abolitionists would say, we want to dismantle settler colonialism because there's too many harms involved in maintaining it.
What would that look like for you?
Oh my gosh. For me as a Lakota, and again, I don't speak for all Lakota people of the entire nation, but I have to go back to the Treaty of 1868, which the settlers, i.e. the Americans, acknowledged the national boundaries of our homelands. So that's one thing. Settlers said, oh yeah, this is your homeland, and that is your nation. So the treaty is a political relationship between two nations or two peoples. And so we have that. We have a nation-to-nation relationship with the settlers. So this treaty says, look, here's your boundaries. We recognize your boundaries. That's your nation. The second thing it says in that treaty, and I could read the language, which is very, very unambiguous, says there should be no settlers in this territory. They cannot reside. They cannot trespass. They cannot have occupancy in our homelands. That homeland is reserved for the use, absolute use and occupation of Lakota people. That's in that treaty. The language is so clear. So the question I ask settlers in my homeland is, what are you doing here? You are here illegally. You guys are undocumented immigrants. Show me the paperwork that you belong here. And they can't. So what do you do when you're in that situation as a settler? Well, you better figure out something. But of course, the force and might of settlers, I mean, this is an occupation we're talking about then. We're talking about settlers illegally occupying our homelands. We have settlers who are in our homelands that shouldn't be there. So that's a straight up occupation. And I always find it very informative that I know the Ukrainian and Russian conflict is complicated and has history behind it and everything, but so do Lakota and white settler relationships. They have their history and very complicated as well. But when I see the United States taking a position that the Russians cannot annex Ukraine, I say, well, hell, if the Americans are up in arms over the Russians annexing parts of Ukraine, then how come the Americans annexed our territory, then nationalized it, and then opened it up for settlement? Tell me, I want to have an American sit down in front of me and explain what that difference is. How can the United States, or how can the Americans, how can settlers on one hand be against the annexation of someone else's territory? And yet, that's what the settlers have done to us and a lot of indigenous peoples. And don't think that the world doesn't know that. You know, you think the Russians are stupid people? They know the Americans have annexed hundreds of indigenous homelands and then nationalized them and then incorporated them into the United States. And that's the erasure that we talk about.
No, for the Lakota, those treaties that you made reference to were then broken, and Lakota have only a small fraction, from what I understand, of the lands that they lived on for such a long time. There's a question in the chat that talks about, what about those folks who don't even have, who were forced off of any of the land that they would have been on? And this is particularly a phenomenon in the eastern part of the United States. And that idea of sense of belonging and place when you're not connected to the ancient lands. I don't know if you can speak to that. I don't want to force you to speak to something, but I'd be curious of your thoughts about belonging as it relates to folks who've been displaced, forcefully displaced off of any of their lands.
Well, I can only, again, my nation is very fortunate. I mean, we fought. That's why we have, and we remain in our homelands to this day. One thing your American settler textbooks will never talk about is how we militarily defeated the United States. And so the United States came out in 1868 and said, what does it take to have a peace with the Lakota people? And we said, well, this is what it will take. So that's what that treaty was. It was a treaty of peace initiated by the settlers. And there's a lot of reasons why that happened. I cannot even begin to explain what it would have been. At one time, settlers came to us and said, you know what, we're going to move you to Oklahoma Territory. And we said no. And they said, well, we will send in settler troops to accomplish that, like a forced removal. And we said, fine, do it, but there will be a bloodbath from the northern plains all the way down to Oklahoma and then back, because we will just fight removal. And so other nations were not as fortunate for a lot of reasons, you know, smallpox epidemics and other kind of diseases that reduced a native population. So there were a lot of reasons, but I can say this much. I talked to a lot of Black folk, and one of the things that I see is what settlers don't know in this country, or what they refuse to acknowledge in this country, is that settlers stole indigenous bodies out of the African continent. Those were indigenous people settlers stole. They stole their bodies and they put them in North America. And then they stole their labor to generate enormous wealth for settlers. But when I talk to Black folk, you know, there is this sense of just severe displacement from their homelands in the African continent, because these are indigenous peoples, mind you. So all those who are descendants of the enslaved people are descendants of indigenous peoples, as I am a descendant of indigenous people. So and you can see how that forced removal, actual taking, has really broken the umbilical cord to one's homeland. And then we don't even have to deal with Black folk on that. We can deal with the boarding schools that has happened in North America. In Canada, they call them residential schools. In the States, we call them boarding schools. But the criminal kidnapping of our children and then beating the crap out of them if they spoke their native language, and they universalized that kind of punishment throughout. I mean, they cut their hair, they made them wear Western clothing, and it was immersion into English. And, you know, those were not, to call them schools is criminal. They were short of those boarding schools and residential schools were concentration camps for children. And they would put the Nazi party to shame, to be honest with you, to take the most vulnerable population of a people and remove them. And now we have to deal with that today. 2-3 generations later, we have people who can't speak their native language, find it hard to get back to their homelands. They're more westernized than they wish to be. So there's a lot of harm that settlers have perpetuated and still perpetuate against indigenous peoples.
I want to amplify one comment. Katie Mansfield just offering the website for the Aunties Dandelion, a media collective that opens space for Indigenous creativity, voices, wisdom. The Washington Examiner is a conservative newspaper, and it had an article calling for the end of Indigenous Peoples Day, and probably would object to Indigenous land acknowledgments as well, with one argument being that Indigenous peoples were attacking and conquering each other and their own lands as well. So what would your response to that be?
I'll say, show me the evidence. You know, I'm not saying that indigenous peoples didn't have conflict, but one of the things that the settlers wrote about when they came over here and don't take my word for it. Look at the settler diaries, and they talk about like the Powhatan Confederacy of the East Coast. 32 indigenous nations were part of a confederacy, and confederacies were the signature of many indigenous peoples. The Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee, the three nation confederacy of the Odawa. My nation, we have 7 what we call council fires. And when you go through Native North America, one of the signatures is that we had confederacies. Now, if you have confederacies, that means you've worked out these relationships, including conflicts. So I would love to see the evidence that these guys talk about. Now, there's a brutality. Certainly settler colonialism has amped up the violence, where Native people are put in a position, just as when Native go into the U.S. military today and they're shipped over to Afghanistan or Iraq, they are fighting indigenous peoples, no different than what they did back in the 1800s when they used scouts from one nation to scout against another nation. And those were coerced recruitments. So for people to say, well, these settlers, I mean, before we came, there was brutality, and there was just savagery among Native peoples. I don't see the evidence for that. They cannot point to any kind of religious crusades that happened in North America like we could point to Europe. Shit, how many religious battles were fought in Europe? The Inquisitions that were going on in Europe, you'll never find that out here. It's just a settler poppycock that's made up to justify, well, they were doing the same thing we were doing. I seriously question that narrative. And I tell the settlers to show me the evidence. Show me the evidence where that is. And they may point to something post-settler, but that also, cherry
Not sure if you're able to hear me. Take a moment while we're doing this just to amplify one of the comments from Mallard Angel, talking about what you spoke about as being disconnected from one one's language, the boarding schools. So in a similar way, the comment says, we speak and write good English while we struggle with our native languages. It is sad because now my kids cannot really learn native from me, and it gets worse with each generation. Right after my mom, we are a lost generation, breaks my heart. And I wonder if you could, and there's a follow-up comment there, also being viewed like the less westernized you are, the less valuable you are, the less value you have. Your accent, your fluency in English, cultural practices, all being undermined if it doesn't meet Western standards, being called naive and backward. Perhaps you can relate, tell us how you relate to that and what you're seeing. I think you're usually in Rosebud, right? What are you seeing amongst the younger generations there, and their culture, their sense of cultural identity?
Well, we're first of all, I want to give a shout out to my Kenyan sister. I know she probably has her native nation, but they go by Kenya, but I want to give a shout out to her. I often find that when I talk with indigenous people from the African continent, boy, we have a lot to talk about. Even though we're oceans apart, we share a lot of the same worldviews as indigenous peoples, and yet also the colonization aspect is something we can talk about too. So I'll give a shout out to her and want to recognize her for that. Yeah, that is Native people are in the belly of the beast of the settler society. I mean, there is y- I was at an Indigenous Day discussion on the 10th of October, and we talked about language loss. And it got to, and you could see the settlers in the crowd going, "Oh man, that's kind of too bad. You guys are struggling to maintain your language." And I thought, no, this is not right. So I said to the settlers, I said, "You white people, we are the second largest language group in the state of South Dakota. Why don't you learn our language?"
Hmm.
And that just, they almost shit bricks on that one. Like it never occurred to them, right? It was like, oh, poor Native people, they're losing their language. Too bad. Well, we still have a language pool that's vibrant enough to revitalize a language. But the state of South Dakota, you can't get them to start learning Lakota, although we are the second largest language group in the state other than English. What does that tell you? So, there's all this contested space when you live in a settler society, and it don't matter to me if they're Democrats or Republicans. When it comes to Native people, it becomes a white party. The Democrats, the Independents, and the Republicans all become a settler party when it comes to Native people.
With the young people in your community, are they speaking Lakota, and how do you see them relating to these traditions?
Well, theoretically, it's possible if you have language in decline that's either threatened or endangered. Theoretically, it's possible to switch that in one generation, but it requires resources and planning to be able to do that. And you target the younger children. I believe our younger people have a fever, in a good way, for language, for the Lakota language. And in some ways you can see that expressed. We as a people, we love to sing. We have a song for about everything that's humanly possible. And one of the things that you see a lot of young Lakota boys and girls do is they're attracted to song, so our traditional songs. So as they learn those songs and the stories behind those songs, they get some exposure to the Lakota language. And then we live in a digitized age where I sense that, you can go to YouTube and Google Lakota language, and boom, you have the Lakota language up there. So there's access to our language now that we've survived into the digital age, where a lot of this stuff can be recorded. And so, and I know families that are using the Lakota language more and more, and it's there. And I don't want to put too much of a rose-colored lens on this, but it is a struggle in a predominantly English-speaking nation. There are white settlers who see no value in the English, in native languages, so they'll push curriculum that is just pro-settler, including English. But I do believe there is a revitalization of the nation, which includes the language, but it could be stronger, it could be more robust. And I see some hopeful signs that we can maintain our language, although it is a threatened language. When I was growing up, probably you heard Lakota spoken in our communities, probably 90% of the time. Now I go back home and I very rarely hear Lakota spoken in communities. It's spoken, but it's spoken in different pockets, So, the jury is still out on that, but I think we recognize that we need to we need to preserve and maintain and keep our language robust.
In the land acknowledgement that you have attached to your email and that you read out for us, you said in your last words, the litmus test of any land acknowledgement is the rightful return of stolen native land. Can you say more about returning native land? What do you see that looking like? What native lands? What happens to settlers on that land? Tell us more about that.
It's interesting when you, of course, you know, it's interesting when you have these discussions with settlers because, you know, the settler narrative is so pervasive that how they talk about this issue is so insightful, right? A good number of settlers will say, like, yeah, we should give land back. And I go, now wait a minute. First of all, it's not yours to give. It was never yours to give. You stole it. So you can only return stolen goods, stolen property. So to say give land back, I said, that's settler hubris. You never owned it. You stole it. So it was never, you can never give what you never owned or had. You certainly stole it, so you can return it. So that kind of nuance, you know, settlers use the English language in order to posit positionality. And so that what does land return look like? Well, for my people, we say, I mean, we want land return. There's no going to some restorative justice circle and talk about the harm. We know the harms, the land stolen. Addressing the harm, we know, well, return our land. So we know what we want. And then we look to the settlers and say, figure out how you want to do that. Come back with us with a plan, a proposal of how you want to do that. We've been saying we want our land returned since you first stole it or you annexed it and then nationalized it. So we know what we want. How does that look to you settlers? What does land return look like to you settlers? And that's where you have settler fragility just kick in, right? I mean, you get the settler genealogy, as I call it, or it's been called, where all my ancestors have been out here for 5 generations. We worked hard for this land. And I said, well, who didn't? We did the same thing, but we've been doing it for 20, 30, 40,000 years. You've only been here, what, 5 generations? That's nothing. So I think that issue of land return falls squarely on the shoulders of settlers. Like, what does that look like to you? I know what I want. I want the land returned. Full sovereignty, full nationhood. And then let the settlers struggle with what that means to them. And then come back with a proposal. You know?
Now, you brought up restorative justice. So what do you have to say to restorative justice practitioners about addressing harms, and particularly the first harm?
Well, gosh, you know, I thought that when I wrote that chapter in my book, like undoing the first harm, settlers in restorative justice, I think I questioned whether or not when they talked about harms in settlers, you know, in circles, in restorative justice circles, or any kind of reparative circles, or community justice circles or transformative justice circles, when settlers are in those spaces and they're beginning to talk about addressing harms and undoing them, as an indigenous person, it's hard for me to sit in those circles and say, how is this even ethical? That you can talk about harms, addressing those harms, and then undoing those harms when you never even address the first harm. You cannot be telling like settler children that stealing is wrong, and yet settlers stole a whole continent. How does that square in a settler's soul? And so I question settler morality, settler ethics. I actually, can, as an Indigenous person, can we go into these settler spaces and trust settlers will do the right thing? That's an open question. So I think that to me is like, I have a hard time being in settler circles or mixed circles with settlers, and there's no like how do you do this without addressing the first harm? I posit and I propose all the problems settlers are having today, every freaking problem settlers have today is because of the first harm. When that first harm happened, all other harms started flowing from that first harm. You return our land, you'll take care of your problems today and into the future. That's what I propose to them.
So, and for those who aren't familiar, first harm refers to that initial stealing of land, right?
Yeah, the first harm refers to the theft of native land and the harms that come with that. And I read this great quote by a native leader in 1609 when he told settlers out on the East Coast, when he asked them point blank, why should you take by force that which you may obtain by love? He said that to the freaking settlers 413 years ago. That question is still relevant to this day. Why should you take by force that which you may obtain by love? I think that falls on a restorative justice community.
Yeah, what a powerful statement. I want to encourage folks, if they are listening to this and have any comments or questions that you've been keeping to yourself, to share those if you'd like. We don't have we've been taking some all along. And so this is as close to a designated question and answer time as any for you to weigh in. I want to thank Dr. Valandras just for the conversation so forth. I also want to make a plug for a film that we watched last night here at Eastern Mennonite University. There's an informal Indigenous Acknowledgement and Land Relations Committee that's looking at these issues. And we hosted a filming of the documentary called The Territory, which has to do with current land stealing that is happening in Brazil, in the rainforests. And I particularly encourage people to watch the film if you want to get a sense of what it might have looked like in the United States and other parts of the world for land to be taken, the various different layers that go into that, and to also educate yourself about how this continues to happen in the present day in one of the most biodiverse large carbon sinks that all of humanity benefits from. So I'll put the link in the chat so that you can go there and check that out. I'm not sure, Dr. Valandra, if you've gotten a chance to see that film. it's yeah, highly recommended. I am curious whether there are any film depictions of that you would recommend for folks in the northern parts of Turtle Island that help create a sense of, you know, a real that depict the life, the humanity of what's going on in using the medias that we have now more and more available to us.
God, I'm, you know, I'm trying to think of some films. Well, the short answer is I can't think of any right now. But I do know in the last probably 30 years or so, there's been a lot of Indigenous people coming up and getting into media, film, and they have been doing some interesting work on current events and relating them to the modern context. But I wouldn't be able to tell you what those are right off the top of my head. But there's works out there that are pretty good. I think in Canada, when I was up in Canada for a while, I used to watch the ATPN, the APTN, Aboriginal Peoples Television Network. Man, they had some good programming up there. I enjoyed that. But also, you know, whatever, like the Indigenous Aunties one, that would probably be a really good site to go on. And you know, when I seen the term Indigenous Aunties, my heart took a skip, because Native Aunties, man, they are like, they're both cool and frightening at the same time. So you know, they're really so yeah, I think, you know, there's a lot of literature and film being, I've not kept up on it, but I think compared to 30 years ago, there's more variety now.
And we've got some of those suggestions from you and from others in the audience in our chat here. So check that out if interested. Please go and check out these stories as they're told from Indigenous peoples themselves. There's one comment in particular I'll highlight here. In Canada, there's a brand new film. Will also be a mini-series by Marie Clements depicting 120 years of a family in residential schools. And it's very long-term impacts. Bones of Crows is the name of that film. And then there's also the links to the Auntie's Dandelion, the film Dawnland, the film that I mentioned, The Territory is there. Last year, around this time as well, kind of in honor of Indigenous Peoples Day, month, hopefully year, we filmed Exterminate. We showed Exterminate the Brutes. That's another powerful film that talks about settler colonialism from a very global perspective. Any last words, Dr. Valandra, about restored justice, the first harms, land acknowledgements? Anything else you'd like to leave us with?
Well, Halloween is coming up, so please don't wear anything Indigenous. You know, that's just a bit of the humor stuff, but you'd be surprised how many people will still don Indigenous costumes that has that kind of, you know, defamation to it. No, I just appreciate everyone taking the time to be on this webinar. And, you know, if you want to contact me, mind if I put my email in there?
Sure.
Oh, okay.
Feel free. We'll make sure it gets out. Yeah.
Hold on. See if that works.
All right. Yeah. We'll have our tech team put that out onto the publicly visible chat line there. Anything else, Dr. Valandra?
No, I just want to thank you for inviting me, and I really appreciate it. Maybe if you have a couple minutes after, we could visit.
Yeah.
Okay.
So to close us off, I want to thank you for your time, for your wisdom, for your courage. I hope, like me, I hope the rest of us in the audience here can simmer these words, can reflect on what it means to have a settler colonial structure that we're a part of, what it means to acknowledge land, but go beyond that. What are the things that we can do, and the work that Dr. Valandra urges us to do if you are a settler in recognizing and addressing the first harm. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Mary for some final announcements. There we are. And I want to thank you all again.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Dr. Valandra and Tarek, both. So I'm just going to announce some upcoming webinars. On November 16th, we have the Building Restorative Communities webinar with Holly Northam, Paul Nixon, Ivo Ayertson, Estelle McDonald, and Salim Tariq. And then on December 14th, we have a webinar called Two Threads, One Tapestry, a Settler Indigenous Conversation, Restitching the Landlines, Bloodlines, and Songlines of History. We have a currently ongoing STAR Level 1 training, and we have one coming up for STAR Level 2, starting, I guess that's ongoing also. And you can receive a restorative justice graduate certificate that allows working professionals to continue working while completing their studies. It helps you reflect on your work and increase your knowledge and skills. This certificate may be all you need to revitalize your vision and work. You can learn more at the link below. And Restorative Justice in Education provides you with a different focus options for K through 12 educators, administrators, or other school leaders, community leaders, and social workers or school counselors. There's an RJE concentration. Students in the MA in Education program can pursue an interdisciplinary concentration in RJE by taking courses through the Education Department, as well as EMU's Center for Justice and Peace Building. And there is also an RJE graduate certificate. It's a 15-hour graduate certificate in restorative justice in education. You can also get an MA in conflict transformation and an MA in restorative justice, which involve practice-based curriculum. They explore nonviolent and restorative responses to conflict. They foster reflective, value-based practice and critical self-reflection. And they focus on restorative justice, psychosocial trauma, strategic peace building, community development, organizational leadership, and create a unique specialization. And this is our site, zaire-institute.org. Visit often, receive updates on webinars, get connected to resources, and learn about events that are taking place. And you can partner with us in continuing our webinar series or other work of the Zaire Institute and donate at the website below.
Back to Tarek.
All right, thank you again. I'm going to turn it back to Tarek for closing statements.
Oh, I thought I gave mine already, but I'm happy to say in last words here, hope to see you at our future webinars. If you were interested in this topic, then definitely the topic after next with Aline and Kisa Tandemuk will be of interest as well. And then if you're looking at a global, what's happening in the world with restorative justice, the next month is there for you. Encouraging you all to continue doing the reflection and the work that's so important, particularly if you're a restorative justice practitioner. I think we're challenged to think about our work, not just in terms of the small harms, but the large harms as well. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a beautiful day.